And even if you modify this model a bit and say, well, it is not only transmission, but it's also translation from the scientific language into the everyday language, for example, even then the performance of science journalism seems to be bad if you use the accounts and the statements of scientists, the evaluations of scientists about science journalism. Very often they, and many studies show that scientists always, not always, but very often find errors in the science stories about their work, and find that the work is not put into the proper context, that it is sensationalized, and so on and so forth. So the expectation based on that model would be that the accurate translation is keeping the meaning of the original message. But again, if you look at the first slide, and this is the title of the paper, if you keep the original meaning, it will never reach the public, because nobody would be interested in reading it, and I mean, it's almost impossible to translate it. Translation is only possible between languages or between cultures where there is some kind of common experience behind it. So my concept, not only my concept, but the concept of many critics of this information transmission model, is science journalism as observation of science. And I start with two quotes from former science journalists, Dutch science journalist Artie Gisolf. I met him in a workshop, and he explained his concept of science journalism. He says, science journalists are like foreign correspondents reporting about the faraway country of science. And I think this is a very good picture, and this is actually what they are doing. So science is very strange from the perspective of everyday culture. And science journalists are looking at the country of science as a correspondent looks at Egypt or some strange country that has a culture that's different from our culture. And the key point of this model or this comparison is that the foreign correspondent applies the perspective and the values not of the country about he or she reports, but the perspective and the values of the country for which he or she reports. That is, if journalists report about, let's say, Islamic countries, they use our values to make sense of what's going on there, and they do not use the values of the countries about which they report. And I mean, if you apply that to science journalism, it means science journalists have to apply the values and perspective and interests of those outside science when reporting about science. Another quote, a little less polite, by Victor Cohn. I think he has been a great science writer during his times. He once wrote, "Scientists are to reporters what rats are to scientists." And I mean, this is a very, very clever perspective, very, very clever quote. It says, well, scientists look at laboratory rats and they observe them and they put them under stress to measure the reactions and so on and so forth. And they would not really be interested in what the rats think or the meaning they give to this experimental situation, except that they observe the meanings they produce in that situation. And he says, well, what we as science journalists do to scientists is more or less the same. You are our study objects in a way. I mean, this is I think it's the proper way of looking at science. And I mean, this does not mean that you have to be hostile to science. This is not the meaning of that. But you have to maintain or keep an external perspective when looking at science. So, the meaning of events in science is created through observation and by the observer. That is the key point of this external perspective. And the observers apply their own perspective and that of the audience. if I go home and I tell my wife about this visit to Quebec, I will use my perspective on the visit and not yours or somebody else's perspective. I will also anticipate what my wife is interested in to learn. Perhaps not the content of this lecture, but the nice view from a hotel room, you see. And in a way, this is what science journalists also have to do for their audience. However, having said that, making sense of science is almost impossible without interaction with scientific sources, let's say interaction with scientists. And the foreign correspondent reporting about an Islamic country, to take that example, always will have to rely on native guides, people who know that culture from within, and at the same time know the perspective of the foreign correspondent. And so these people will be able to explain the meaning within that country of certain events, ceremonies, or whatever happens, political acts, to the external observer. And so they are kind of hybrids. They have to be fluent in a way in both the systems, in the system of science and in the system of public communication. In a more theoretical way and less by means of anecdotes and examples as if I have tried to explain it, my colleague Matthias Koring, a German communication researcher, uses system theoretical conceptualization of journalism based on Niklas Luhmann's system theory. And he says, well, science journalism is a specialized subsystem that observes science according to an own logic. And that means to him and to Niklas Luhmann, autonomous journalism. So autonomous journalism means being able to apply an own original perspective and not using the perspective of the area of the field you report on. The same is true perhaps the same is true for politics, for economy, for other areas too. But of course, because of the esoteric character of science, it is particularly demanding from science journalists. Another aspect, I think, related to that science journalists do not only carry scientific knowledge, but they are involved in creating original new knowledge, is a perspective of integration of knowledge. There is a distinction, for example, between scientific knowledge per se, that's what's coming out of experiments and so on, and scientific expertise, that is the application of that scientific knowledge to social problems, let's say climate change or solving the drug problem and so on and so forth, the development problem and so on. And all analysis of how this scientific expertise is created say it is important to recognize that scientific knowledge alone is not sufficient as a basis of scientific expertise. You have to integrate it with knowledge about the specific situation, for example. If you talk about how to solve a problem, let's say, in a developing country, you do not only have social scientific theories, you also have to have knowledge about the specific situation of the country. Yeah? And Helmut F. Spinner, a German philosopher, says the social problem solving requires a combination of two rationalities. One is the principle-based rationalities, that is the domain of science. Science is looking for the principles, for the laws, for the natural laws, for example, for general theories. And the second kind of rationality is occasion-based. That means looks at the specifics of situation, not on the general knowledge, but on the specifics of the situation. Brian Wynne, you may know the work on sheep farmers after Chernobyl, argues the same. Actually, there is a lot of work going on in the field of sociology of knowledge, looking at the integration of different kinds of knowledge sources in order to produce scientific expertise. And I will show in a moment, I think journalism catalyzes the transformation from scientific knowledge to scientific expertise. And so my colleague Harald Heinrichs and I, we made the phrase co-construction of public expertise. That is, journalists contribute to the production of scientific expertise, not just to the transmission.